Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next in the series of CPD in 43, where we are going to have Amir of Yemetech talk about a really interesting piece of analysis software that they've developed to analyze open source data and see how that can affect change in regard to design and development, etc. Amir is not only CEO of Yemetech, but also runs a busy architecture practice in Bradford, is on the LEP board in the Leeds area, and holds a range of other board positions throughout the country, and is a very, very busy individual. So thank you for your time. Just as usual, please comment within the chat box if you have any questions. We are going to field a Q&A session towards the end of the event. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it straight over to Amir, and I'll be here in the background. So please ask me any questions as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Usman. That's really good of you. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for having me. It's really great to be here, and especially to see so many people sort of interested in this area. I think just to give some context to this, and just to give some background, and maybe add some relevance to it, I think it's very significant that it all started from an architect's practice in Bradford. And essentially, what we were seeing was that there were master plans and kind of new sort of visions being done for the city. And in my lifetime, as somebody who was born there, I think there's probably been at least 4 where these kinds of things have been done. And I think they've not really worked. And I would argue that the reason they've not worked is because they didn't really understand what was going on in those places, in those communities, and they didn't use that information to create something as a stronger proposition. So that was one of the drivers. How do we really get to understand a place, and how do we really get to understand who's doing what with whom, and what sort of stakeholders do we have within a place? So that's kind of where it started from. And I would say the second example of relevance was, if I was to take one of the areas in Bradford town centre, in the city centre, and somebody came to us and said, well, I've got a 10-acre site. I want to have a national science and media museum. I want to have a national arena. I want to have a major theatre. I want to have offices, shops, and a hotel, and so on. If we were designing that, we'd be designing that a bit like if you imagine going to a resort where everything is kind of connected. And the same person who goes to one thing is kind of exposed to all the others, and they go and do and interact with all of these things. Now, interestingly, in Bradford and a lot of places like it, you do have all of those things, but it doesn't feel like a destination, and nothing does feel connected. So essentially, what we began to look at was, how might we not only digitally understand what's going on within those places, but how might we also be able to connect people into all of those things through a digital platform? Because we don't control all of these assets. They're not in our control to be able to operationally change what they do. But how might the user experience enhance it? So that led to what we started developing, which started out as essentially a community app that was a sort of geospatial tool that, as you walk around, things that are going on around you would become highlighted to you. What we then began to find was that actually the data that was coming out of this was actually, I would say, potentially even more important than the app. And so it kind of became the other way around. So that's what I'm going to present. And that's the kind of overview of how we transition from what I would say is quite a traditional, if creative and design-led practice, into a technology platform. So if I just share my screen, I should be able to present. Right, just 1 second. Sorry, I'm working from a laptop in London. Can you see that okay?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, excellent. So essentially, we've developed something that we call the Community Data Platform. And what this is designed to do is to enable any new development that's going into an area to do it in a way that allows the community to benefit from it. So when we look at the kind of silos that we have within those communities, how do we overcome those? How do we deal with the breakup of and fragmentation of communities and isolation and loneliness? And one of the ways that we've kind of addressed this is, or identified this, is if you see all of these things that have disappeared from communities largely up and down the country, people have lost the opportunities that they used to have to interact with each other. And if you imagine something like EastEnders or Coronation Street, well, if you took all those things out of it, you'd never be able to make the drama because nobody would ever actually meet anybody and you'd never get those storylines. But that's actually what's happened in communities. So what we're doing is we're looking at a place, and we can choose anywhere in the UK, and we're starting to look at what are all the things that enable people to connect together around the assets that are within their communities. Now, a lot of this thinking has come out of our work with somebody called Lord Mawson and the Bromley by Bow Centre, which is renowned for socially uplifting East London. I won't go into detail about what they do, but they've done some really, really phenomenal things. And our work and thinking behind all of this has emanated from their work. So our approach to this is to say there are 3 steps that a new development can take in a way that will allow it to maximize the positive impact into that community. So we start with this idea of understanding the place, and this is under Foundation Place Insights. And this is essentially the strengths and weaknesses of an area. We then look at how do we use this concept of a walkable neighborhood, this idea of a 15-minute neighborhood, as a means for uplifting the existing and the surrounding communities to wherever you're putting the intervention. And then the third element is how do we integrate not only people within the new development that might be being proposed, whether that's commercial or residential, but how does our presence in that location actually serve as a benefit to everybody else? And I think the starting point for this is that, in a lot of cases, new developments are really forced into communities against the community's wishes. What this does is allows us to highlight what the issues and opportunities are, provide a solution, but that solution is linked to the new development. So the way people receive this new proposition is very different to how it would be when it's just being sort of imposed upon them. So if we take the Place Insights, this essentially is about taking a series of open source demographic data, things to do with the multiple deprivation index. So this is a national index which highlights things like health, poverty, exclusion, and there's a whole series, I think there's 21 parameters that are being measured within that. There's a loneliness index, which is measured on how many people are living alone, on a low income, with self-reported health conditions, and there's something else as well. I think there's four parameters. But from that, you can then work out what the likely loneliness index is for that place. Ethnicity ratios is a really interesting one because a lot of places, especially we find in the north, a lot of places are very ethnically segregated. And so how do we start to understand that? And how do we start to address that through creating broader communities? And then property values is a really important one because understanding what properties are actually selling for starts to highlight whether there's an affordability crisis, whether there's a viability crisis, what types of properties are being sold, and which things are missing. So when you're putting a new scheme in, you're able to use that information to support your proposition. One of the things that we're doing is taking a lot of data that is already out there This is not new data. This is data from open sources. However, what we are doing is concentrating it on a 20-minute zone around any site. So what that does is it allows us to layer all the different types of data. So in this example, in Newcastle, we can see that the elderly population is increasing to 18% by 2040. The income levels are above national average. It's the fourth loneliest place in England for the elderly. That's the ethnicity makeup, and those are the land register transactions. And that's localized for a particular space, because normally we might get information on a citywide scale position, or we might get it on a ward level. But actually, if your site is sat between 3 wards, it's not really much use. So what this does is allows us to localize that. So it's all about creating information that we can then use in an evidence-based way to justify the schemes that we're producing. So I don't know how many of you have kind of come across the kind of 15-minute neighborhood concept, but I mean, it's not a new thing. It's been around for a long time. But COVID has led to a situation where people are evaluating their live-work balance in very, very different ways. And this idea of having a neighborhood where you have the key things that you need within a 15-minute walkable zone of where you live is now seen as an incredibly good way, one, from a sustainability perspective, two, to build and support relationships and address isolation and loneliness, but also to kind of reinforce localism and to help with sustainability beyond decarbonisation. Now, the challenge with this proposition has always been the fact that individuals are individuals, and so therefore they've all got different needs. So 2 people could live side by side. I'll just check the time. The 2 people could live side by side, but they're not necessarily fulfilled. So what we're doing is we're saying, what are the things that everybody could benefit from, regardless of their ethnicity, their age, their hobbies, their interests? So things like, I don't know, ATMs, cash, parks, shops. Well, they are essential assets that really anybody can benefit from. So that's one category. The second category is, what are the lifestyle benefits that would add more value to a group of people? So that might be faith interests, or it might be hobbies or sporting interests. And then the third one is, how many different types of lifestyle assets could we achieve within a place to start serving the broadest possible demographic within that area? So that's the kind of process of categorization that we've developed. Now, we've got access to over 700 assets. So these literally hundreds of different types of assets. And we know the kind of things like what type of restaurant it is, what type of shop it is, what the opening times are, so on and so forth. So what we can now do is say, well, what are the things that should go into category 1? What should go into category 2? And what should go into category 3? And in this case, it gives us a list that looks something like this. Now, this is illustrative, and we would normally suggest this is done through public consultation or through demographic research based on the area that we do at the beginning. But that sort of gives us an overview. Now, it gets interesting when we begin to plot, where do those assets exist within a city? Now, this is the city of Bradford. And what we can see is that cluster of assets occurs in all of these areas where the white spots are, with the light blue areas around them. So in other words, the light blue areas are the walkable neighborhoods that already exist. And what that means is that if we then add in the category, the second category, well, now it only goes down to those areas. If we then add in the third category, it's now only in that one area. So what happens is we begin to see, where are the dark patches? Where are you more likely to need a car? Where are you likely to put more interventions in if you want to create a walkable neighborhood? Now, when we then zoom in to the 15-minute neighborhood around our site, Well, this is an isochrome showing the actual walkability of a 15-minute neighborhood based on the street layouts that are there. And what we see in this case, and this is in Bradford, that where our site is here, all of those things already exist. So actually, this area is already a Category 1 walkable neighborhood. However, when we go to Category 2 and we start adding in the Category 2 things, well, then the things that are highlighted are the things that are missing from this area. So then if we're putting a new intervention into an area, if we start to tick off these boxes, either because we're going to put it in or because we're going to arrange with one of the local providers or one of the third sector or charity organizations, maybe they're going to do it, but we're the facilitators for it. What this does then, and this is Category 3, what this does then is it creates an environment where our development starts to really benefit everybody that lives within that area, because we can now start to define it as a 15-minute area. People can start adapting their activities in relation to it. Transport links can be seen differently, and so on. So it allows for a viewing an area through a very different lens. And how does our development help to achieve that? And the third element is the fact around the activities that take place. And this is all about now, how do we integrate people around the things that are already going on? So it's all about an asset-based approach to regeneration. So what we do is we map all the activities that are taking place within an area, and then we filter it through these categories. And what that does is it starts to allow us to do things like this. So this is, in this case, it's a 20-minute neighborhood. This is where we can begin to see where are there different clusters of activities in and around our site. So if this is our site, what's the relationship? What things can we help to facilitate? And how do we understand any incoming occupiers in here? What's their relationship with these clusters of activities that are around them? When we go into more detail, this is showing us within that 20-minute area, all the organizations that are listed that operate from within that area. And what we can then do is start to see what each one of them is actually doing. And in this case, and this is again in Newcastle, this shows us that the greatest percentage of activities are faith-based religious activities. The least is music and art. So now we can begin to see what should be incorporated into our schemes, because we can see what's missing. We also noticed that the least amount of activities are for the elderly, even though actually here there's quite a large elderly population, but they're the least provided for. And then this is probably the one that's the most stark, is when you see how many free activities there are versus how many paid. And in this case, there was only 8% of the activities. There was nearly 7,000 activities over a 6-week period, and only 200, excluding religious activities, there was only 250 activities that were free. Now, given the deprivation issues in this area, this is a real problem. Now, this kind of information, when we present it at a public consultation or we present it back to the council, they've never seen this before. They've never seen this kind of information. And that makes the scheme, the justification for a scheme, really powerful. Now, that's really great from a, let's say, a consultant perspective and from an analytical perspective. But ultimately, it's about creating transformation on the ground. And for this, we've developed a community app. Now, this is about how do we connect people into all of those activities that we've now gathered and we understand, going back to the point that I made right at the beginning. And what it is that we know that all of this information already exists, but it's all in different places. It's not easy to find, navigate, share, and actually sort of identify where things are happening around you. What we're doing is aggregating all of that information into one place. We're categorizing it around different interests, and then we're making it personalized to people's use. And then this is a video which shows how it would work for a user. But what we're aiming to do is to offer this as a white label app to a developer, to a building occupier or a hotel operator, so that they can create a closed group. And by creating a closed group, it means people can build their relationships in a much safer environment, because everybody from within that is from the same building. So this was designed for a student accommodation provider, and this is a video. And there we go.
Great. Is that? I just want to double check. Is that have you finished off your presentation there?
Sorry, yes, that was it. Yes.
Sorry, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. No. I generally finish it on the video, but I can't continue. Fine. Believe me.
No. Obviously, I'm sure. So the really interesting point is to highlight. I know, obviously, we spoke about the high level benefits of the software, but when we last spoke as well, we went into some detail about a specific scheme which had using this software had basically managed to increase density and also provide for the issues in essence that you've highlighted in there. So almost those red spots you basically managed to cover within a scheme in Leicester, didn't you? So it'd be really interesting, as long as it's open source information, sorry, apologies if it's not, if you'd briefly like to sort of give the highlights on that, that'd be awesome. And whilst you're doing that, I'll quickly read the couple of questions that have come through, and then I'll field them to you as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I can quite access that scheme to hand immediately, but I can talk you through the scheme. I mean, I think the one that's probably the most graphic for us is a scheme that we did in Milton Keynes. And essentially what we had was a site in central Milton Keynes, which the council demands a mix of housing types within this development, including 3-bedroom family apartments. And it was about a 350 unit scheme, apartment scheme. And they were also asking for a 1-to-1 parking ratio. Now, what our evidence highlighted was that, one, Milton Keynes has got a very severe shortage of young people at 19 to, actually from about 19 to about 29, that sort of age. There was also an issue of a lot of young people at 15 to 19 who were living at home, and there's actually no accommodation for them to move into. The other factor was that Milton Keynes has got one of the biggest rising inequality gaps of any place in the UK, in that there's a lot of new people moving in who are very wealthy, and there's a lot of people who are already there who are not. And that gap is becoming rapidly increased. And when we did the analysis of all the activities and all the assets that were around us, it's actually, out of all the places that we've mapped, it's actually got the best 15-minute neighborhood that we've ever seen. I mean, it's literally got absolutely everything on your doorstep. So when we started putting that information into our scheme, what we were able to then demonstrate was that having 3-bedroom and larger size family accommodation does not solve the problem that Milton Keynes has with attracting young people who can afford to stay there, but also for a younger demographic who is being forced to move out. So it would solve that problem. It would allow us to go for more smaller apartments aimed at that demographic, so to reduce the larger ones, so that then improved the density of the scheme. And it also crucially highlighted how perverse the parking requirement was of 1-to-1 when we're attracting a younger demographic that doesn't have cars, that it's got everything on its doorstep. There's a climate emergency, and they're asking for a parking ratio that just doesn't make any sense given that evidence. So that's the kind of way that we use it to inform a scheme.
Great, thank you. I've got really interesting questions. How do you incentivize new assets being built? So obviously there's the almost highlighting that there's an issue, but then obviously then there's the, I guess presumably it's quite an open-ended question, but there's that commerciality slash policy slash etc. So there's quite a few tangential points from that.
No, it's a really good question. I mean, ultimately what we're finding is that most developer-led projects, their biggest challenge is getting planning consent. And it's the biggest sort of, up to that point, up to achieving planning consent, it's a very uncertain project. They're really speculatively investing a massive amount of money into a scheme without actually knowing what they're going to achieve at the end of it. If they can demonstrate that they can do things within that area that will improve the area, then by inference, it's going to make it easier to have the public consultations. It's going to make it easier to have the committee meetings with the planning committee, and it's also going to help it achieve planning consent. So that's a major incentive for any developer to position their scheme in a way that eases the planning application process, even if that's not something that they inherently is something that's at the core of what they believe. But because it helps them get achieving planning consent, then it helps that. That's the first thing. The second thing is in relation to the fact that most schemes are going to have Section 106 contributions. Now, normally that disappears into a council black hole, and it manifests itself somewhere, obviously, but it's not something that you can directly claim any credit for. If, however, you are able to show that in this area there are things missing, and you want to try to position your Section 106 contributions towards those activities or those facilities that are missing, and thereby provide the greatest uplift, ideally with an existing organisation that's already on the ground, who you've identified, who is already active, is already doing things, and we've got a lot more parameters than I actually shared there by which to identify those. What that does is, again, it comes down to this pure self-interest of getting the best planning consent that they can possibly get in the shortest possible time. And public consultations are becoming an increasingly sort of onerous component of the planning process. So I think that's a key kind of area. So I think that it does require some shaping. So we find that there's a lot of consultants that really like this software because they will do the shaping and they will then use that to advise their clients.
Thank you. Sorry, that question was from Charles. We got a question in from Simeon. It's basically they're looking at creating a neighbourhood forum in Norwich, and basically want to understand how they could access this service, basically.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I see there's also one about the website there. So at the moment we have developed this entirely during the COVID period, and this is a spin-off from something that we've been doing within our own architecture design and just doing it in-house ourselves prior to that. We're kind of at the moment at a pilot stage, and we are essentially operating as a consultant. So if somebody comes to us and says, this is a site we have, this is the site we'd like to analyze, we will then give a price for giving the information based on the presentation that I've just given. And that's generally how we're currently working. We are now doing a fundraise, and we are going into a commercial model going forward. And we're expecting that by midsummer, there will be an interface that people will be able to access themselves, put in a postcode, and it will give them the localized information around that site. And it will either be on a one-time charge, if they just want that one area and that one space, or if it's a consultancy that is doing a lot of work in this area, then we'll be offering a sort of subscription model where they can use it repeatedly. So that's the kind of approach of where we're going, and that also kind of explains why at the moment the website and so on, we're not really a commercial model position at the moment, where we are operating and we're working for a lot of sort of really big names, but it's and we're working with a lot of other architects, I should point out, but it's at this stage it's still at a sort of a pilot stage.
Great. Yeah, so you briefly covered Catherine's question about the app versus website / access side of things. So thank you for that. Obviously, if you feel like elaborating further, then please do.
Yeah, I would do, because that is a really important point. And, you know, adoption of an app is a really difficult thing to do. It's not easy to get people to download and use an app. And I think that we would be looking at as many places as possible presenting this information, from a doctor's surgery, a school reception, a community centre, places of worship. So you can basically see what's happening tonight, you can see what's happening today, and so on. But where we're really offering this is organisations that have got their own community group. So it might be a housing association, it might be a student accommodation provider, it may be a multiple occupancy office building. And what we're doing is, by giving them a white label app that they can put their name on, that means that their users are connected into a physical community within their building or within their street or within their development. And it's that approach that is really seeking to try and be the adoption route, rather than us offering it out to the general public. It's really kind of aimed at organisations that have got their own community groups as a starting point.
Great, thank you. We've got a question in from Adam. How do you ensure that the information that you're capturing is qualitative? So in essence, what's your quality assurance in regard to that side of things, which I think is quite an interesting question, actually.
Yeah, no, it's a critical one, because it's only as good as the information's accuracy. So the information related to place insights is all open source data. That's information like, you know, the Office for National Statistics or Land Registry or so on. So that is pretty robust. You know, there's you know, that information generally is widely accepted. The information around assets comes from a number of sources, but essentially there are organizations that will gather this information based on data from, for example, Uber, or from Just Eat, from Google, from others, and they collate that information. That's how you create Google has a lot of this information, but it doesn't make it available in this format. So that type of information is information that we access from third parties, but those third parties specialize in that. Now, ultimately, if there is a website for a restaurant and that restaurant's website's timings are not accurate, then this isn't going to be accurate. But that means anybody going to that restaurant would have the same issue. So all of this information, including the activity data, is all about what is already online. So it's information that is already in the public domain. What we're doing is essentially collating that information and we're categorizing it. Now, where we do an area and we map, for example, for the activities, is a very technologically sort of onerous task to do because it's an incredible amount of data. But what that does is it means that we understand the route into every source of information once we've mapped it once. We're doing this information, it's done in an automated way, so it's done digitally. And every time it is swept, essentially, over that site, if any of the coding relating to any of the changes, anything changes on that website, such as a date or an event or something's cancelled, it's picked up in the coding. That's the way that we then identify it, and that's how we then update it. But it is reliant on the information in the first place that's being put out into the public domain being accurate in the first place. It's no different to Google's opening times, for example. You know, they're relying on that information from the website.
Thank you for that. And then we've got a question in from David. Do you find developers being receptive to your findings and significantly altering their schemes as a result? Or I guess the big thing is as well is so it would be great if you were getting involved right at the very sort of fruition, sort of concepts, very early concept stage to almost lead these discussions. So I'll let you go with that.
Yeah, so to the first question, yes, we get a lot of interest from developers. As I said, because of the points that I mentioned earlier, the fact that they want to get planning consent. There are obviously developers who genuinely do want to do something that's good. What we're increasingly finding is there's a higher level of developer, or tier 1 developers, that are entering into joint ventures with councils. And they're doing bids with councils on council projects where there's a joint approach to delivery of some sort of a major regeneration proposition. On those schemes in particular, the developers can see why this information would benefit the council. What we're finding from councils is they're absolutely amazed at this information because they've never seen it before. It's never been produced before. So if a developer comes forward with this information, it changes the tone of that conversation. And so what we're seeing is that the developers are buying into the idea of it because of the planning. The council are buying into it from the point of view of it allows them to take an evidence-based decision. And then in terms of the, so your last point just slipped my mind. What was the last point?
So basically, the crux of it is that the developers and how receptive they are to.
Well, I think what was about, what happens if if you're doing it right at the outset. Yeah, it obviously helps to inform the scheme right at the very outset. However, what we have found is that when you look at the data, you can nearly, the data is only one aspect. It's then a case of how you choose to interpret that data. And one of the things is around sort of to what extent are you duplicating things that are already there, or to what extent are you filling a gap? And it's very easy to be able to use the information to start supporting one argument or the other. But I mean, in our view, obviously the earlier the better, but we've been involved in schemes where there has been a developed proposition and the richness of the data starts to give us a lot of different insights.
Thank you for that. We've got another one which is quite interesting as well. Is has the 15-minute city/20-minute neighborhood type sort of scenario, has that been fully adopted by planning systems? And are you finding that there's a mismatch? Because we quite often find, depending on which local authority you're dealing with, they have a slightly different interpretation, etc., or may have a different focus.
I think that's a good question. At the moment, I don't know of any local plan that's adopted it. So that's that is a factor. However, I think the post-COVID narrative has thrown up so many different situations that I think people are now in a position to look at communities in a very different way. And, you know, we've done some work in Surrey, a very affluent part of the world. And what their interesting finding was that, and this is with the council, that generally people who have lived there would work in London, would shop in London, and would sort of spend their leisure time in London and literally just come home to as a retreat. But during the whole COVID pandemic, they spent the whole of their time in the community and not anywhere else. And they suddenly felt this was really, really, really inadequate. They felt that their town centre was inadequate. They felt the facilities in their community was, and this had never been noticed before. It never been an issue before, but now it is. And I think that what we're finding is that, you know, there's one thing around an asset-based 15-minute neighbourhood, and there's also something around the activity-based 15-minute neighbourhood. So, for example, you might not have a gym in your area, but somebody's organised a Zumba class in the church hall, or somebody's organised a running club or a cycling club. Now, that could lead to a sense of fulfilment from living in that area, even though there's no physical asset there. So from a council perspective, and I saw a question about the rural area as well, it is about this idea of to what extent can you sort of use the activities as a means of creating a holistic, healthy, integrated community.
Thank you. Sorry, that was from Hirwell. And then we've got a question in from Juliet, who's asking, local councils could benefit from this. Have you had any interest from them directly?
Yes, we have. So we're currently in discussions with a number of different councils. Interestingly, Bradford are actually looking, well, one of the things I haven't shown you here is our geospatial analysis tool. So we have a dashboard that allows you to see everything geospatially and so on. So Bradford Council are looking to adopt this as their GIS geospatial tool for the whole city. And every development, every activity that is taking place would be on this system. So that's one. The other one is we are running a program called the Holiday Activity and Food Program, which is a government-funded project by the Department for Education, providing activities and food for children who are on free school meals. Our platform and our system is the most sophisticated analysis and management tool for the HAF program nationally. So we're now in that. We've now done our pilot with Bradford. We're now in discussions with other councils, and the Department for Education has actually selected Bradford as an exemplar based on the data evidence that our system's providing. So those are sort of some of the areas. But we're having, essentially what we're finding is that when to get into a council and commercially get into an arrangement with a council, everybody loves it, you know, but to commercially translate that into a contract is it's a long process. What we're finding is that the people who are jumping at it are the developers. It's the developers, and they're the ones who are, you know, there's a very obvious NHS and health aspect to this platform around social prescribing, which is a whole different topic. But the area that we're finding we're getting the most traction is with the developer regeneration sort of sector.
On that point, actually, I've been thinking about it, but there is extreme positivity in that regard, because with the developers getting involved, they're often required to include additional elements, amenities, etc. But with this analysis tool, they're able to specifically provide something which is required, as opposed to, I think they want a cafe.
Yes.
For example, whereas with this, it's literally a gym is at least 45 minutes away. We pop a gym into this development, or etc. so on. Then suddenly it becomes almost the busiest gym within a 40-minute drive.
It's absolutely that. And you see, the thing is, from a developer perspective, it works at a number of levels. One, at the very early design sort of concept stage. It's very powerful during the planning process, engagement with the community during public consultations and so on. It can be very valuable during construction for engaging the local community through supply chains or through apprentices and so on and so forth. And then when the development is finished and you want to attract inward investment, inward occupiers into it, the people that you're presenting to are able to see all the things that are going on around, and that then helps to drive occupancy into that new development. And then obviously the app means that they can then build their community through the app.
Great. I think we're going to have to bring it to a close now, but thank you so much for taking out some time in your day to give us a presentation.
No problem.
We've had a really good Q&A session. If you have any more questions that you'd like to field directly to Amir, please do just visit their website. They've got direct contact details there. You can field questions and see how you might be able to get involved and use this amazing piece of kit. We've got as everyone knows, we've got a whole range of talks already uploaded to YouTube. Just type in CPD in 43 and that should take you straight to, I think we've got over 15 uploaded to YouTube right now. This will obviously be added in due course. And just like to say thank you to everyone. We have our next talk, which is in relation to building control. We've got a accredited approved inspector, which is Cook Brown, who will be providing a update on building regulations and also the changes to Part L, which should be very interesting. So please do keep an eye out. That will be posted onto the Eventbrite page, so please do sign up and we look forward to seeing you there. And then following that, we have a talk on CDM, which is from Paul Bussey and Tony Putzman, who are specialists in the area and should be known by many, giving detailed talks on that and working on an array of projects in that on that area. So we look forward to seeing you all at the subsequent events. Thank you again, Amir. I'm going to stop the recording now, but thank you for everyone that attended, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Brilliant.